My job is to give you the bigger picture and to put Whistler as a player in a thing I'm going to call the American watercolor movement. It begins, the American watercolor movement, as I'm going to encapsulate for you, begins with the formation of the first watercolor society in the United States, the American Watercolor Society, in 1866, and their first exhibition in the winter of 67-68. What followed from that moment is an amazing expansion of interest in watercolor painting in the United States, really driven by this society and their exhibitions. It was not a collection of radical, progressive artists. It was actually a group of middle-of-the-road, mainstream painters, but a very liberal and welcoming group that managed to basically within 15 years involve just about everybody in the New York art world. So this phenomenon peaked in the early 1880s, exactly when Whistler starts painting watercolors with seriousness. So I don't think that's a coincidence, and that's what I'm going to talk about. The first big, I dare say, watershed was in 1873 when the Watercolor Society had a huge lone exhibition of British watercolors and then a very large display of American watercolors that seems to have been a huge shot in the arm to this young society, and a number of major talents decide to take up watercolor painting, including the two gentlemen on the screen here, Winslow Homer and Thomas Eakins. Both of them picked up watercolor in the summer of 1873, and both of them sent watercolors to the show in 1874 that included men or boys in boats on the water. These are two artists that do not know each other at all, and it was my discovery of this simultaneity actually that opened up this whole question of what is going on here, that suddenly people are interested in watercolor. It looks like, at first glance, the arrival of Impressionism, because of course this is just the same moment that Monet is painting Impression Sunrise, which actually looks a lot like the Homer. Painting outdoors, painting light and air, painting these leisure subjects, the idea of the sketch, especially in the Homer as an exhibition object, these are all the hallmarks of Impressionism. And so one of the subtexts here is, what is Impressionism in the United States, and when does it come? So maybe you look at these things and you think, hey, is this Impressionism coming to the United States, and is watercolor like the vanguard? Well, actually, what watercolor looks like, for the most part, is William Tross Richards. This is his version of Impression Sunrise from this very same moment, 1873. It is the same idea of light and air and space, but it's painted with this kind of minute and delicate application of watercolor that is coming from the English tradition. It's coming from John Ruskin, and I invite everybody to rush across the mall and see the Pre-Raphaelite exhibition at the National Gallery, which has a lot of William Tross Richards that explains this Pre-Raphaelite taste in American watercolor. It is not impressionistic. It is, in fact, really quite opposite in technique. Well, in this moment, Whistler is a kind of latent participant, and the first two papers have kind of given you that sense of where Whistler is in this moment. He is exactly like most of the members of the watercolor phenomenon, a person who's known watercolor all his life, learned it as a boy. He probably learned it, we know he learned it when he was in school in St. Petersburg. He probably had lessons at West Point, because every military officer would have known how to make watercolors. So he had this in his toolkit, but he wasn't particularly interested. And in fact, the other thing I would say about Whistler, I need to look into this because I'm creating a list of artists whose mothers taught them to paint watercolor. And that list is led by Winslow Homer and John Sargent. Many of the artists of the watercolor movement had women at home who were painting watercolors. Well, the ladies actually come into play here in the next aspect of the watercolor movement that is part of this gigantic, it's a big complex of things that's happening at the same time. And that is the aesthetic movement, the arts and crafts movement. And the watercolor movement is a in this mix here. And this is a moment when Whistler actually is participating and contributing and very much in the avant-garde. This is his picture of the Lange Leitzen on the right from 1864, a woman in Japanese and Chinese robe painting on Chinese porcelain, although I love the idea that she's actually painting on a Bayard vase, but in any event, just think about it for a minute. The idea here is that watercolor was in the thick of the revival of all the decorative arts. It was the tool that the designers used who were so engaged in this moment in the beautiful interior. And 1878, which is the moment that the book, The House Beautiful, was published, was a moment when the idea of artists designing wallpaper and fabric and costume and textiles and working in ceramics. And this is Winslow Homer painting on tiles in the upper right, and then the upper left. And below is a watercolor by Whistler of porcelain. In the 1870s, actually, one of his principal advocations in watercolor was a series of illustrations of ceramics. So he's deeply involved in this crossroads in which watercolor is the design medium and this idea of the beautiful interior. And I'm showing you the view of the watercolor exhibition of 1882 with its Japanese parasols hanging from the ceiling, with fans tucked behind the paintings, and with lots and lots of Asian art scattered in the galleries in order to create this beautiful effect. So that complex of decorative arts is something that Whistler is very attentive to, and that so are the watercolor artists. Well, up until this point, these are all British, the influences. That is the pre-Raphaelite detail, the Ruskinian watercolor style, and the aesthetic movement, which is something really coming out of Morris and the second wave of pre-Raphaelitism. Things get a jolt in the middle of the 70s from a new style that is coming from a new style center. And it's not Paris. It is not Impressionist. It is from Italy and Spain. And the lead talent in this was Mariano Fortuny, whose work you see there on the left, his Arab leaning up against the wall. What was characteristic of the Spanish-Italian watercolor school, and Fortuny especially, he's Spanish and then he comes and works in Rome, is picturesque characters, people in costume, and you see Sargent and Akins picking up this same flavor, and then a dramatic contrast between a wild and brushy and wet background and a very finely painted figure with crisp detail, bright color, but often painted in a suggestive, virtuoso fashion. So contrast of technique and the exotic subject matter. Fortuny is all the rage in Paris in the 1860s. I don't really know whether Whistler knew much about Fortuny. He must have looked at him because he was so much in the public eye, a very, very popular figure. He dies in 1874, and that creates a storm of publicity over his early death. So I'm telling you, I'm thinking Whistler knew about Fortuny. Certainly by the late 70s, Sargent, who is in Venice at the same time as Whistler, this is the prevailing watercolor style in Italy, and Sargent is gathering this in. Akins, off there in Pennsylvania, he actually was in Paris in the 1860s, knew Fortuny's work very well, and is gathering it into his more realist approach. The second shock to the system comes also from another corner, and that is from Holland. And this is, again, not from Paris. It is arriving in the late 70s from what is called the Hague School. I'm showing you the work of Jacob Maris here on the left, one of the leaders of this school, Maris, Anton Mauve. These are the names, very well known. Their work is being imported into the United States. It's basically Dutch Barbizon. It is low in color, that is olives and browns and grays, and it's very wet. The paper is soaked before you work on it, so the color runs and blurs, and so you get this sense of atmosphere and spontaneity from the Dutch school. In the United States, one of the advocates or one of the people who responds to this kind of work, I think kind of on his own track, is George Inness, who is a friend of all the watercolor artists in New York, and his work here from around 1880 is in this basically Dutch Barbizon style. I would say, again, not French. The French are not particularly interested in watercolor at this time. It's coming from other places. Well, the genteel, basically melancholy Dutch style is overcome by a wave of far more radical, wet, spontaneous watercolor painting that comes from Munich around 1879, carried on the work of this one artist, J.F. Curator. Frank Curator is a Boston artist who moves to Munich in the 1870s. He becomes the center of an American community that includes William Merritt Chase, Frank Duveneck, John Twachtman, and a bunch of other American artists, many of them from Cincinnati. He stays in Germany, but his friends bring his work back to the United States. Chase, in particular, owned Curator's work and lent it to the watercolor exhibition. This work, as I'm showing it here, appears in the watercolor exhibition of 1879 like an atom bomb. It was a catastrophic, explosive, critical event because the art world divided completely over. This is really the moment that the avant-garde becomes a thing in New York City. It's over what you think about Frank Curator, because this work was decried by the critics on the conservative side as being basically the end of the world as we know it. I mean, they thought it was ugly and that it had no art in it at all. The artists, however, loved the expressiveness of this. I mean, this was action painting, basically. It's very fast, it's very splashy and spontaneous. Again, like the Dutch Barbizon, wet and low in color, although occasionally with strong, pure color. Curator literally squeezed paint out of the tube along the horizon there in the sunset, pure red coming from his tube. That kind of intensity just astonished people, and this is what the New York Times meant when they said in 1879, the Impressionists are here from Rome and Munich. This was American Impressionism in 1879. It looked like Frank Curator. Well, the result, the impact of this can be seen immediately in Winslow Homer. He goes to Gloucester the following summer and paints sailboats here on the 4th of July, soaking the paper in advance. Again, very low color, that is low darks. This is basically a nocturne that is running and bleeding, and with, again, very limited palette, using just a few colors. And suddenly, who shows up? Whistler. This is Whistler in Amsterdam in 1882. Now, I would say for the first time in Whistler's life, he's actually a step behind. He's not in the lead. He is picking up basically this Dutch wet style, and of course, when he goes to Amsterdam, that's what he does. He's in Holland, he does as the Dutch do, and does this wet style, which has become, I think, is making waves in the general international watercolor world. He, however, is actually already entered the mix in a way, partly through his interest in decorative design and through prints, as the points that have been made in the earlier papers. Americans, in fact, the Watercolor Society showed his etchings in the middle of the 1870s, so people knew his prints pretty well, but they certainly hadn't seen his watercolors. This is when we get to the moment of Venice and what has been mentioned now several times, the Ruskin trial, the bankruptcy, the 14 months in Venice. Well, who is in Venice? You've already met Sargent. Sargent's in Venice at the end of this moment, but also a whole bunch of these Munich students of Duveneck. They were called Duveneck's boys. They were living in the same pension with Whistler. They were all having dinner together, and the Americans are all watercolor fanatics. The person who is the most impressed by Whistler, but who is basically a watercolor artist at this moment and a printmaker, is Robert Blum. And Blum comes back to the United States with watercolors that look like these, shows them at the Watercolor Society, and is immediately declared an Impressionist. So he's an impressionist who comes from actually both Munich and Rome, and consolidates this style that is developing that we are calling Impressionism. The critics actually looked at these and said, these are Whistler's etchings colored. And they didn't necessarily disparage him for that, but they recognized that there was Whistler's print lying behind this, and I think actually also Whistler's pastels. Because when Whistler was in Venice, as we've been told, he only made a couple of watercolors, and I actually sort of think it might have been the Americans who were encouraging him to try watercolor a bit. Mostly, he was on a binge making etchings and pastels, and I think it's actually two-way street here in that Blum's watercolors are also taking up the qualities of Whistler's pastels in these watercolors. They are, in fact, a kind of a crossover between watercolor and pastel that we're going to see increasing in the 1880s. Well, Whistler then gets serious when he gets back to London, as we just found. He starts buying watercolor materials seriously only a couple of weeks after he gets back to London and begins making watercolors in 1881, goes to Amsterdam and paints these nocturnes in 1882. And here is Amsterdam in Winter from 1882. I'm here to correct a mistake in my book that I have now. One of my tragedies is that this watercolor exhibition is happening after my book, because I would have been so much smarter if I had had it. This watercolor I published in my book, this Amsterdam view, as being possibly a watercolor that was shown in New York in 1883. Now the wisdom of the catalog has shown that actually it was a different watercolor, not this one. But the point is, a few watercolors were starting to trickle into New York by 1883. And watercolor in this particular style. And then, as has been noted, he takes up watercolor with great seriousness, with great energy in 82, has a big exhibition in 84 that includes work like this one here from the Freer on the right. And that material begins to be shown in New York, leading up to this major exhibition in 1889 at the Wunderlich Gallery that was a huge display and tremendously influential. What do we see in Whistler's style? The low color, the wetness, the simplicity, the reduction of detail, all of the points that we've heard in the first two papers. Well, the impact of this comes in many different ways. One possible person responding here is John Lafarge. Lafarge is also very early out of the box on the subject of Japanese art. He married the daughter of Admiral Perry, okay? He had lacquer and Japanese prints in his house in the 1860s, and so he was very early into Japan and to the decorative arts movement and into watercolor on his own without ever interacting with Whistler. But finally, when he gets to go to Japan, he paints something that looks like this of Kyoto in the fog that is very Whistlerian, and it may be just a question of great minds traveling on similar tracks. Certainly Lafarge is one of the most important tastemakers in the United States at this period. And he would bring this watercolor back and exhibit it as a finished exhibition piece, which is another theme that we've heard today. The idea that a sketch is something you can frame up and put on the wall in an exhibition is a theme of the Impressionist movement. Well, where is the mainstream of the watercolor movement going? Is Whistler driving this? Probably not. This is what's actually happening to the center of the watercolor movement. The paintings are getting big, elaborate. This is Winslow Homer, 18 months after he painted that sailboat picture with the skyrockets. He goes to England for a year and a half and remakes himself completely and comes back a mainstream English watercolor painter making these big, very finished, heroic, monumental, epic watercolors. At the same time, his friend, Edwin Austin Abbey, these are the two great stars of the middle of the 1880s. Abbey is mostly working in London by this time, and indeed he lives next door to Whistler and becomes a great friend of Whistler's, especially after his marriage to Beatrice Godwin. Abbey is a great pal. You know, that's not what you'd expect. That these two artists would be great friends, but Abbey, his historical imagination, his fabulous detail, This is a watercolor that it's not quite as big as the thing on the screen, but it is big and very detailed. So there's a different note in American watercolor painting that is proceeding. It's not like there's a linear path where everybody suddenly starts getting more impressionistic. However, certain avant-garde continues to get interested in impressionism as we might know it. That is, from Giverny. Impressionism from Monet finally arrives in the middle of the 1880s. There's a big exhibition in 1886 at Durand-Ruel showing watercolors, showing Monet, Renoir, and the rest. And American painters begin to go to France, study French Impressionism, and they begin to look a few like Childe Hassam, his fabulous Island Garden from 1892, which is a textbook essay in Impressionism. Primary colors, painted very quickly, lots of white ground, sense of air and motion, of the flowers bobbing in the wind. This is a classic Impressionist painting. However, we're also seeing what might be described as a post-Impressionist movement in watercolor with Prendergast, who I think probably did look hard at Whistler at that 1889 exhibition, because the climbing composition here, we're in Venice again, so that's a sort of Whistler atmosphere, but nonetheless, the idea of the vertical mounting, the flatness of the composition, these clear little squares of color like we see in Whistler's street scenes, I think there may be some interchange here showing a different side of Whistler impacting American Impressionism, or American watercolor painting. The 1890s, these are actually the glory days of Homer and Sargent, and so this is just to remind you of what's going on here in the mainstream. This is the side of Impressionism that comes from naturalism and realism, sitting outdoors, plein air painting, looking those alligators in the jaw. That kind of direct confrontation. This is plein air painting for sure. It's very colorful, it's very expressive. These two men are the kings of watercolor by around 1900 or 1910. And it's not particularly Whistlerian. But there's a whole other camp of American watercolor painters that look like this. And so the Whistler side is generally smaller, and the watercolors that you see upstairs are generally little sketchbook-sized pages. They are often have this quality of intimacy to them as opposed to the kind of grandeur and energy that you find in Homer and Sargent. Often very close valued, almost monochromatic sometimes, very low in color, not necessarily bright like Hassam and Prendergast, and with a quietness, and sometimes a very powerful sense of pensiveness and of melancholy. This is a style that we call tonalism in American art. It's growing out of the Barbizon school. By this time in the 90s, Winslow Homer and George Inness are the two most famous American painters in landscape. And so Homer is going in one direction. Inness is carrying with him a whole following in what is called tonalism. These two slides show the Giverny side of the story with Theodore Robinson, who worked in France, but who is painting in this soft Whistlerian style and little bitty things, contemplative things, things that, and this might even be a moonlight subject, things that I think are probably done from memory and in the studio. And there are a number of artists who work in this tradition, sometimes outdoors, but generally close valued and small. John Twachtman, another one of the Duveneck boys who was in Venice. Alden Weir, who had been following Whistler along from the 1880 forward. And then the tonalist side, that is the people who were following this sort of Barbizon tradition, Alexander Wyatt, Henry Ranger, this is Bruce Crane, Herman Dudley Murphy. These are like Bruce Crane's snow scene, sometimes a little lonely, this was a sense of desolation, and in Crane's situation, big exhibition pieces, and quite finished, even as broadly painted as they are. I think most of these are from memory. They are not, again, plein air necessarily, but what you see that's Whistler in them is these simple formats and the emptiness of them, the airiness of them, the moodiness of them, that I think also borrowing from a note in Whistler. So ending here with around 1900, what you see is a creation of a style that is partly Barbizon, that is the Innis side of the story, plus Whistler equals tonalism. I mean, I've created a formula for you. And also a sense of a crossover of media that we have seen in the earlier papers, this idea of watercolor creating something of effect of a pastel, and pastels, people mixing watercolor and pastel and charcoal and other kinds of unorthodox things, which Whistler was fond of. This kind of, this mood and this sort of technical exploration are, I think, the legacy of Whistler and watercolor. And with that, we're going to bring some chairs up to the stage and have some conversation.